Are you using the switch action in your flow? Does it look something like this? The function of the switch action is easy to grasp. However, if your flow looks like this, it's redundant and will be hard to manage. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to take common uses of the switch action and level up your flow by creating a dynamic reference key. Your flow will go from this to that. If you're interested in learning how, keep watching. The switch action is an out-of-the-box Power Automate control action. In the on field of the switch action, insert dynamic content that you'd like to evaluate against. Add a case for every value that matches the input you've inserted. It's important to note that the values entered in the equals field of each case must match exactly. If there isn't a match, the actions in the default case will run instead. For this demo, the flow is triggered when a new employee is added to the employee tracker SharePoint list. The switch action checks the department assigned to the new employee. In each case, an email is sent to notify the relevant department manager. Although this logic is technically correct, the flow itself is inefficient. Here's why. You can't insert dynamic content into the equals field. This field will only accept static text. Power Automate doesn't allow you to copy and paste actions between cases. If you need the same actions in multiple cases, you'll have to manually insert and configure them each time. It's highly redundant. If you need to make changes, like updating the email content, you'll have to edit each case individually. When building flows, it's always best practice to reduce redundancies. Although there isn't anything technically wrong with this flow, it's not very efficient. The send an email action is repeated in every case, and the only thing that changes is the recipient, with the exception of the email body in the default case. Instead, a better way of structuring this flow is to do something like this. In this flow example, instead of having multiple instances of the send an email action, there is only one. A variable is set in each case for the recipient, and an expression is used in the email body. A variable is like a container. It stores data that you can reuse throughout your flow. There are different types of variables, such as string, integer, array, etc. For this flow, I've initialized a string variable with a generic email address. You may set an initial value for your variable or leave it empty. A variable must be initialized in the root of a flow. It cannot be nested inside any action. In each of these cases, I've set the appropriate email address based on the department match. Now, I only need a single send an email action instead of multiple instances. If I need to make a change to the email body, I only need to do that once. Although this is a step up from the original flow, let's level up this flow and make it even better. A dynamic reference key is a JSON object that maps a key, like a department name, to a value, like an email address. Think of it as a centralized lookup table within your flow, stored in a compose action. Instead of hard-coding values or using multiple actions, you can reference the key dynamically to output the value you need. I'm going to use this simple flow to help you understand what a dynamic reference key is. In this flow, I'm using the getItem action to return a single item from my SharePoint list. In a compose action, I'll output the selected department for the SharePoint item. Since this column in my SharePoint list is a single choice column, I'll need to select the value dynamic content. When I hover over this dynamic content label, you can see the expression. Notice the text in the square brackets between the single quotes. It's body, department, value. Run a test. Let's review the outputs of the getItem action. Here in the raw outputs, you can see that the selected value is nested inside the department, which is nested inside the body. Let's build a dynamic reference key that will output a specific email address based on the selected department. Remove the dynamic content from this compose action and rename it. Remember to always rename your actions to keep your flow organized. Start off with a pair of curly brackets. Next, insert each value you'd like to map to an email address. Ensure each value is wrapped in double quotes and is followed by a colon. In my case, I'll insert a few departments. After each colon, insert the email address you'd like to map to the value with double quotes. If there is more than one email address you'd like mapped, ensure you separate each with a semicolon. Insert a comma after each line except for the last line. Each of these is called a key-value pair. Here's the key, and this is the value associated with it. For testing purposes, insert another compose action. Remember the expression from earlier? We're going to compose one to output the email address from the dynamic reference key we just created. Insert an expression. Enter a question mark, square brackets, and single quotes. In between the single quotes, enter a value. For testing purposes, enter sales. Place your cursor at the start of the expression by pressing the up arrow key. Insert the output from the compose action with the dynamic reference key. Run a test. Let's review the outputs of the compose action. It outputs the email that is mapped to the sales key. Instead of hard-coding this value, insert the dynamic content of the department value from the get item action. Click on the expression to edit it. When using dynamic content, you don't need the single quotes. Since the department column in my SharePoint list is a choice column, I'll insert the value dynamic content of the department column. Don't forget to press update to update the expression. This employee's department is marketing, so it outputs the values associated with the marketing key. I've added the send an email action. The email address is dynamic, and the subject and body of the email includes dynamic content. This flow is now a lot easier to manage because of the dynamic reference key. You can adjust the flow's trigger to an automated trigger. Personally, I like to keep a copy of a manually triggered flow to help with troubleshooting purposes or to make it easy to test my flow if I want to make changes at a later date. Although the get item action isn't necessary, I'm going to keep it in my flow so I don't need to adjust any of the dynamic content references in subsequent actions. I'll just insert the ID from the trigger into the get item action and my flow is now ready to go. It's always best practice to use trigger conditions with an automated trigger. If you aren't sure how to do that, make sure to check out this video. For my flow, I have a trigger condition to only trigger this flow when an employee is added to the list with a status of new. Instead of having a flow that looks like this, you can simplify it to look like this. I have a Microsoft form to collect RSVPs for a party. I've got this question here that asks the recipient to indicate if they'll be attending the cocktail hour and/or dinner party. All responses are added to this SharePoint list. The RSVP column is a multi-choice column. When a form is submitted, the output of this question is exactly as it appears in the form. For this particular submission, the user selected both. Multi-choice answers from your Microsoft form are returned in a JSON formatted string. We'll need to convert that to an array. Add a compose action. This compose action is optional as we can use the expression directly in the next action. However, for demo purposes, I'll be using a compose action to show the output. Insert an expression. Use the JSON function. Click the Dynamic Content tab and insert the dynamic content from your form that contains the multiple choice response. Run a test. Before using the JSON function, this is the output of the multi-choice question. Now it's outputting as an array. I'm going to copy these two lines so that I can use it in my dynamic reference key. Add another compose action. We'll use this compose action for the dynamic reference key. First, insert a set of curly brackets. Next, paste the content from your clipboard. Add a colon after each of these double quote marks. Next, insert the value you'd like to map each choice to. Remember that these values should match those in your SharePoint list and that they should be wrapped with double quotes. Ensure there is a comma after each line except for the last one. Next, add a select action. We'll use this action to format the choices in the array so they can be used in the SharePoint list. Multi-choice columns in SharePoint require each choice to be an object with a value property. In the From field, insert the output from the compose action that is storing the multi-choice selections from the form. If you aren't using a compose action in your flow, insert the JSON expression directly into the From field. In the Key field, insert the word value. In the Value field, insert an expression. We'll use the item function to output the selected choices. Run a test. The select action is used to transform arrays. In this case, we're using it to transform the array of selections from the form into a format required for SharePoint. However, we need the output of this value to be cocktail party and this value to be dinner. Let's adjust the expression used in the value field. Click on the expression to edit it. Add a question mark and wrap the item function in square brackets. Press the up arrow key to go to the start of the expression and insert the output from the dynamic reference key above. Don't forget to press Update to save your changes. Run a test. Here, in the input of the select action, you can see the selections made from the form. The changes made to the expression has used the dynamic reference key above to output the values that match those in the SharePoint list. Now I can use the output of this select action in the Create Item action. I have a SharePoint list of clients, each assigned to an employee. The list includes a contract renewal date column. I want to create a Power Automate flow that sends reminders to the assigned employee 90, 60, and 30 days before the renewal date. In this flow, I'm using the Convert Time Zone action to convert the current date and time from UTC to MST. I have 3 compose actions that output the date in 90, 60, and 30 days using the Add Days expression. To learn more about how to work with dates in Power Automate, check out this tutorial. Add another compose action. We'll use this compose action to create a dynamic reference key that contains dynamic content as the key. In between each of these double quote marks, I'll insert the output from each of the compose actions above. For the values, I'll enter the number of days in between double quote marks. Remember to add a comma to the end of each line except for the last. Run a test. The output of this compose action is a JSON object where the 90, 60, and 30 dates are the keys. How is this helpful? To output the value associated with the key, I need to use the key in an expression. Let me show you. I'll add a compose action to this flow temporarily. Insert an expression. Add a question mark, square brackets, and single quotes. In between the single quotes, I'll enter a date. In this case, I'll enter the date in 30 days. Place your cursor at the start of the expression by pressing the up arrow key. Click on the Dynamic Content tab and insert the output from the compose action above, the one with the dynamic reference key. Run a test. This expression has returned the value associated with the key, in this case, 30 days. I removed the last compose action that we've added, and I've added the get items action to the flow to get the list of clients. It's always best practice to define a filter query when you can. Reducing the number of items returned from the get items action can help your flow to perform better. In my case, I'm filtering out items with an active status and a contract renewal date that is equal to the 90, 60, or 30 days date. By default, the get items action will only return 100 items. If your SharePoint list has more than 100 items, you'll need to toggle on pagination and set a threshold. My list only has 23 items, so I'll leave this off. Whenever I use a filter query in my get items action, I always like to add a compose action to output the count of items returned. This can help with troubleshooting. I've added an apply to each action to loop through each item returned from the get items action. In this scenario, I'd like the email subject line, body, and recipient to be dynamic. Although you can set up your flow like this would mean that you would need to manage 3 different send an email actions, one for each date. Personally, I prefer to have a single instance of a send an email action in my flows and utilize dynamic content instead. This way, I can adjust the recipient to myself for testing purposes and I don't need to be redundant. I'm going to use the compose action to compose the subject line of the email. This is optional and you can insert this content directly into the send an email action. I prefer to use compose actions to output my dynamic content first as it speeds up the flow building process and I don't need to wait for an email to arrive in my inbox. To output the number of days the contract is up for renewal in, I'll use an expression. Insert a question mark and square brackets. Based on the previous demo, this expression needs a date as the dynamic reference key. Since the only available dynamic content from the get items list is body and value, we'll need an expression to get the contract renewal date of the current item. Insert the item function and add a question mark, square brackets, and single quotes. I'll need to manually enter the internal column name for the contract renewal date column in between the single quotes. In my case, it's contract renewal without a space. If you aren't sure how to get the internal column name of your SharePoint column, I've linked a video in the description box below. Place your cursor at the start of the expression by pressing the up arrow key and insert the output from the compose action that contains the dynamic reference key. Customize this compose action to suit your requirements. I've added some static text and additional dynamic content. Run a test. Next, we'll compose the recipient based on the date. For 90 days, I want the email to be sent to the assigned to user as well as the finance department. For 60 days, I want the email to be sent to the assigned to user as well as the sales department. For 30 days, I want the email to be sent to the assigned to user only. Although you can write an expression for this, the if function only takes 3 parameters. The first is a condition that outputs a true or false value. The second is a value to return if the condition is true, and the third is the value to return if the condition is false. This means you'd need to write an expression where one if function is nested inside another, and if you aren't familiar with how to write expressions, it can become a little confusing. Instead, we'll create a dynamic reference key for this. Copy this compose action and insert it into the apply to each action. I'm going to replace the static text between the double quotes with the appropriate recipients. Next, add another compose action to output the recipient for the current item being looped through. Again, this is an optional step. However, I do like to verify my dynamic content output before using it in subsequent actions, especially if the action is sending an email or Teams message. Insert an expression. Add a question mark and square brackets. Just like previously, I need to use an expression to get the contract renewal date of the current item being looped through. Place your cursor at the start of the expression by pressing the up arrow key and insert the output from the compose action that contains the dynamic reference key for the email recipient. Run a test. Review the outputs of this compose action to ensure the appropriate email addresses are being outputted. Following the same steps as before, I've added a dynamic reference key for part of the email body that I want to make dynamic. Add a send an email action and insert the output from the compose action with the recipient into the to field. Next, insert the compose action with the subject line into the subject field. Since the intro of my email is the same no matter when the contract is up for renewal, I'll enter that content directly into the send an email action. Use an expression to output the dynamic content for the body of the email. Add any additional static content to your email if needed. This particular flow will send a single email for each client that has a contract renewal date in 90, 60, and 30 days. If you'd like your flow to send a single email for all clients due in 90, 60, and 30 days, you'll need to adjust the logic of your flow. Check out this tutorial if you're interested in seeing how to build a flow that sends a single email with multiple SharePoint list items. Hopefully I've inspired you to use a dynamic reference key in your flows. If so, you may want to consolidate your dynamic reference keys into a single key. Let's take a look at the previous example. I'm going to delete the send an email action for now. Instead of having a separate reference key for the recipient and email body, I can combine the two into one. Copy the content from the original dynamic content key first. Replace the values with a set of curly brackets. In between each of the curly brackets, define your key and value pairs. Remember to omit a comma from the last key value pair. How do you access these values? Just like before, you'll need to use an expression. The only difference is that you'll need to append the key of the value you'd like to output. Let me show you. Add a compose action for testing purposes. Insert an expression. Add a question mark and square brackets. In between single quotes, enter the item expression and the internal column name of the contract renewal column. Press the up arrow key to go to the start of the expression. Press the Dynamic Content tab and insert the output of the dynamic reference key. This is the same expression we've used previously. However, since the dynamic reference key has nested values, we'll need to add something to the end of this expression. Press the down arrow key to go to the end of the expression. Insert square brackets and single quotes. Between the single quotes, enter the key of the value you'd like to output. For this example, I'll insert email. Run a test and review the outputs. Let's output the email body instead. Click on the expression to edit it. Add the word body to the end of this dynamic content key. Press update to save your changes. Run another test. Now we can get rid of these extra compose actions in this flow. Add any additional key value pairs as needed. This technique can be applied to a variety of scenarios. However, for more complex situations, such as when you're working with a large dataset, need centralized updates, or require advanced filtering, using a SharePoint list, Excel table, or Dataverse table as a lookup source is a more efficient option. If you'd like to see a tutorial on how to use these as a lookup source in your flows, drop a magnifying glass emoji in the comments. If you found this video helpful and plan to use dynamic reference keys in your flows, please consider giving this video a like. Want to take it a step further? If your SharePoint list has a multi-person column, check out this tutorial to learn how to send an email to all assigned users. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any new Power Automate tutorials. Thanks for watching!